Alright, hello and welcome to our final event of this Wonder Week. That was rubbish. Welcome to our final event of this Wonder Week. Thank you, that's much better, much better. Alright, I'm Joel, I'll be helping look after you tonight.
And I'm Priscilla, also love to look after you.
Great. So today we're going to hear from Michael. A big thank you to the two people doing music, to Isaac and Karis. It was very fun and even interactive. So tonight we're going to hear from Michael. He's going to come up in a minute. We're then going to have a chance for questions and Q&A at the end.
We'll be using our usual method, our good Slido code, which is 194972.
Wow.
Woo. Guys, do come and get a seat once you've got all your drinks and all you'd like to get. Do come on and sit down.
Alright, well we're going to welcome Michael up now. It's great to have you with us.
Michael, we've got to know you a little bit over the week and learned some fun things about you. Is there anything you'd like to tell us? Anything we don't know? Any fun facts?
I'm sure there's lots of things you don't know, thankfully, maybe, in some cases. Fun fact, when I was 2 years old, our family were on holiday near Gatwick Airport. Now you might be wondering why our family were on holiday near Gatwick Airport. That's because we didn't have much money, and we did a house swap. And so for one of our days, we went to watch aeroplanes at Gatwick Airport, in the days when you were allowed to get near them. And walking across a walkway at the airport, about 30 feet above the ground, I, a young toddler, walked off the edge and fell about 40 feet, landed on my head, fractured my skull, and got rushed to a hospital that wasn't actually open officially yet. A few days later, the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, came to open the hospital, and I was on national television at the 6 o'clock news with Margaret Thatcher. I was also on the front page news back home in the local paper, and I lived to tell the tale.
Wow. Quite a happy to follow that. Yeah, we're going to leave it to you, Michael. Thank you for coming to speak to us.
Great. Thanks, guys. Well, what a joy it has been this week. I know most of us would rather have been on Zoom. Not. But what a joy to be able to be in this tent, to be able to eat wonderful food, to be able to meet new people, and to be able to explore together some of the biggest questions of life, and to see what Jesus has to say in answer to them. I don't know about you, but I have really enjoyed being here this week. In fact, a few moments ago I thought I'd be staying here all weekend, because I nipped next door to the toilet without a card, ran in behind someone who was going in to do some study, and then realised that I couldn't get out. And I was thinking I'm going to be stuck here forever, but thankfully I wasn't. But it's been a joy being here, so why don't we say well done to the Christian Union for putting on this week of events. Now, it may be sad that it feels like it's coming to an end, but it's not. We will tell you later on about what's happening next, because we hope that this week is not the end, but actually the beginning for many people of a journey of exploring and discovering Jesus Christ and all that he can mean for them. But this is the last talk, and we're looking tonight at this question: can we be hopeful about the future? I think if you would ask my generation of students 20 years ago, can we be hopeful about the future? Most people would have said yes. There was a great degree of optimism at the turn of the millennium. I don't know why there was a degree of optimism. I mean, somehow the fact that the data changed, seemed to make everyone feel that the next millennium was going to be better. But there was optimism. Technology was solving the world's problems. There was hope that this world would be a better place, that the 21st century would be better than the last. But 22 years on, I wonder whether our optimism has remained. We've experienced 22 years of the threat of terrorism. We've just lived through 2 years of a global pandemic. We can see soaring inflation rates and an uncertain economic future. We think of the environmental crisis and its impending impact upon our world and our lives. And we see even more immediately, the very real threat of conflict in Europe once again. Can we be hopeful about the future? Maybe we're not so sure. And I was struck recently that actually, according to surveys, particularly amongst younger people, that actually many people are increasingly pessimistic about the future, and increasingly Brits are the most pessimistic of us all, according to that. I don't know why the Russians are so optimistic. You'll have to ask them. But also, not only are Brits most pessimistic about the future, but actually we think that our country is not getting better, but actually is getting worse. So maybe you'll be forgiven tonight if you feel a fear of the future or a pessimism about the future, because you're not alone. And that fear perhaps is not necessarily unfounded. But maybe there's another reason why we have fear of the future. And that is because actually in the Western world in which we live, we have adopted, thinkingly or unthinkingly very often, a naturalistic worldview. In other words, a worldview that says that all that exists is what we can see and touch. That this world and this life is all that there is. And beyond death, nothing. And if you think about that for any length of time, and the reality is most of us don't, do we? Because we don't like thinking about it. But if we were to think about it for any length of time, that actually is a pretty pessimistic view of the future. Because it means that everything we do and achieve and live for will count ultimately for nothing. Now I say most of us don't think consistently or very long about those ideas, but someone who did was a philosopher called Bertrand Russell. In the mid-20th century, he talked about this view, this naturalistic view of the future, and he put it very honestly when he said this: man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and his fears, his loves and beliefs are but the outcome of an accidental collocation of atoms. No fire of heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labours of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. And the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Cheerful chap. But actually a very consistent chap with his worldview. Because if this is all we have, what is the point? What is the point? But actually what we've been saying this week, throughout this week of wonder, is that this is not all there is. And the Christian faith says that there is more and that there is hope. And we've been thinking about that already through the events of this day. But you might be saying, but how do I know that that is real and not just wishful thinking? A projection of our longings. I don't know if you've ever watched the film The Invention of Lying. Directed by Ricky Gervais, and he plays the lead character, a chap called Mark, and he lives in a hypothetical world where nobody can lie except him. And in a world where nobody can lie and everyone believes what people say, and you can lie, you can have a lot of fun. He can go into a bank and tell the bank manager that he has lots of money, and the bank manager gives it to him. He can meet a beautiful woman and he can say, how wonderful he is, and she's obviously quite blind as well, and she believes him, and he has lots of fun. But then there's a moment, a very, very moving moment in the film, where his mother is dying in hospital, and she expresses her fear of death, the fear of nothingness beyond. And Mark sits there by the bedside of his mother, thinking how he can comfort her, and then he says this, he says, "Mother, but you don't need to fear, because when you die, it's not the end. You'll go to a wonderful place and all your friends will be there. There'll be no more pain. There'll only be singing and happiness and dancing." And with a smile on her face, she breathes her last and dies. It's a very moving scene. So you stop and think about what the film is actually saying. What Ricky Gervais, as a very committed atheist, is saying. And what he's saying is, all of that is a lie. It's just wishful thinking. People believe that stuff because they want it to be true, not because it is true. Now, Ricky Gervais wasn't the first person to think of that idea. Freud actually thought of that idea. He talked about our religious beliefs as being projections of our longings into the heavens. We just want it to be true, and therefore we think it is true. Of course, the problem with that argument is you can turn it the other way around, can't you? You could equally say that his atheism is a projection of his longings, not wanting there to be a God or a judgment to come. Cuts both ways. But ultimately, what I want to say tonight is that the Christian faith isn't simply based on a wish fulfillment, but it's based on something we can check out. Not just an idea, but an event. And what we've been saying already all day is this, that the Christian hope for the future is based on a historical event, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, 2,000 years ago. An event that either happened or didn't, but if it did, makes all the difference to the world and all the difference to us. Now, you might be sitting here tonight saying, well, why should I even consider that? Isn't that ridiculous? Well, I want us to consider it tonight because what may surprise you is this, that even amongst scholars who are not Christian, atheist and Jewish, there is a great degree of agreement about certain things that must have happened historically in relation to this claim, even if they don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And 5 pieces of evidence that we might consider tonight that are agreed upon by almost all scholars. Let's look at them briefly if you've not looked at them before. What is the evidence? Number 1, Jesus was crucified. We have that not just recorded within the text of the New Testament in front of us, but we have it recorded in other historical documents as well. So one historian said it's one of the most attested facts of antiquity. Jesus' crucifixion under the governorship of Pontius Pilate. He was killed. Number 2, Jesus wasn't just crucified, but the tomb was empty. In fact, no one doubted the empty tomb for at least 200 years. That was the first time we have recorded evidence of someone speculating or questioning it. And indeed, the Christian faith couldn't have really begun if the tomb hadn't been empty, because it would have been so easily falsifiable. There was a tomb with a rotting corpse inside it. And as we helpfully had heard from Chris at lunchtime, one of the remarkable things is this, that the first recorded witnesses of that empty tomb are women. And in that culture, the culture of Jesus' day, women's testimony would not have been regarded as reliable in a court of law. So why would you invent a story like that if it didn't actually happen? So the tomb was empty. Number 3, the disciples were convinced that they had met the risen Jesus. It wasn't just that they fabricated a story, they had to be convinced somehow that Jesus was alive because they were willing to go to their deaths for this claim. Now, of course, sometimes people die for things that aren't true, but people don't die for things that they know aren't true. And the disciples were utterly convinced somehow that Jesus was alive because they were willing to go to their deaths based on this claim that they had met him, they'd encountered him. Something had happened to convince them. Number 4, the lives of Jesus' followers were transformed by this belief in the resurrection. And not just the lives of people who had previously followed Jesus, a case of confirmation bias because they wanted this story to be true, but the lives of people who hadn't, like Jesus' half-brother James, a skeptic during his lifetime, a leader of the Christian movement in Jerusalem in the decades afterwards. Or someone like Paul, a persecutor and opponent of the Christian faith, who becomes convinced of the truth of Christianity after an encounter with the risen Christ. Lives transformed on this claim. And then number 5, the explosion of the Christian movement in the first century. One Roman historian, Tacitus, tells us that Nero was able to fasten the guilt of the fire of Rome upon the Christian community in that city. And that tells us something very interesting. It tells us that the Christian faith had spread right to the heart of the Roman Empire within a couple of decades and was so numerous that the emperor was able to blame this now large group of people for an event that most historians, of course, suggest that actually they didn't actually commit. But this had spread, and it had spread in spite of religious opposition and political opposition. People had everything to lose and nothing to gain from a human point of view in embracing this movement, and yet somehow it spread. Why? Well, those are the 5 pieces of evidence. Jesus was crucified, the tomb was empty, the disciples had some experiences that made them convinced Jesus was alive, their lives were transformed based on this belief, and this movement exploded with growth over the next few years. And the question we have to ask of all of this is this. How do we explain that? If that is what happened in history, how do we explain what happened? And actually, over the last 200 years, people have thrown this open to great scrutiny. Only a number of theories have been put forward as to what might explain the evidence. And as Chris said at lunch, if you can think of a better one, stick it on Slido, we'll look at it later. But here are some of the explanations that have been put forward over the years. The first one is this: someone else died on the cross. That is the conviction of many Muslims and the teaching of Islam, that it wasn't Jesus who died on the cross, it was someone else who looked like Jesus. Jesus didn't die. But the only documentation that we have of that is from several centuries after the events in question. That was never suggested at the time, and there's no reason to think it did happen. Jesus was a well-known figure, and the authorities had been out to get him, and they wanted to get their man. And the crucifixion was a very public event. Secondly, some people say, well, Jesus didn't actually die. It's sometimes called the swoon theory. Jesus passed out on the cross, they say. People's medical knowledge was less. They missed the vital signs of life. They put him in the tomb. He resuscitated in the cool of the tomb, and then he came out of the tomb, and people thought that he had actually risen from the dead, but actually he hadn't. What do we make of that? Well, firstly, we know that Jesus was dead, partly because one of the eyewitness testimonies of Jesus' life tells us that when a spear was thrust into his side, what appeared to be blood and water came out separately, which they wouldn't have known at the time, but we subsequently know would have been evidence that death had occurred. But if we ignore that for a moment, let's just imagine what would have had to have happened for this to be the case. Jesus would have been brutally tortured to an inch of his life, and then strung up on a Roman cross for several hours, had a spear thrust into his side, and then, taken off the cross, all the people missed the vital signs of life. Passed through various pairs of hands, he's wrapped up in yards and yards and yards of burial cloth and placed in a tomb, and then sometime, over the next few days, he kind of wakes up. And then, of course, he has to get out of the burial cloth, so he unravels himself as fast as he can. And then he ravels it all up again to make it look like it, was something else. And then he pushes away this massive stone, runs past a bunch of Roman guards, dips himself in a nearby river to wash off the blood, finds some clothes from who knows where, gets into a locked room and appears to his disciples, and he manages to convince them that he is the Lord of history who's conquered death and not a very sick man in need of urgent medical attention. Kind of takes a little bit of imagination, doesn't it? Here's number 3. The women went to the wrong tomb. I did hear someone once say, well, they were women and they're bad at directions. Now, I didn't say that. Because you have to bear in mind that the blokes also went to the wrong tomb after the women came and reported the tomb was empty. They all went to it repeatedly wrong. Now, 2 reasons why I don't think that's the case. Number 1, if you've ever buried someone you love, you don't forget where you buried them. Number 2, let's just imagine they had gone to the wrong tomb. A few weeks later, one of Jesus' followers, a guy called Peter, stands up in this same city, and he starts declaring to a crowd of multiple thousands of people, Jesus, whom you crucified, is alive. And someone at the back of the crowd would stand up and go like, no, Peter, he's dead. Like, you guys went to the wrong tomb, you numpties. Like, Jesus' tomb is down there. That's Uncle John's tomb. They moved his body away last year. I mean, the whole movement would have been a laughingstock in Jerusalem. It wouldn't have got off the ground. What about this? The body was moved. Well, I guess the question is, moved by who? 3 possible scenarios. Number 1, moved by grave robbers. But you'd have to ask the question, why would grave robbers risk their lives to break into the tomb of a body of a penniless preacher and then steal the body and leave the only thing of value behind, the grave clothes? Doesn't seem to add up. Number 2, keep going on that. The body was, number 2, was it the authorities? The authorities could have moved the body, they had the access to the body, but then of course why would they want to, given that they wanted everyone to know that Jesus was dead? They wanted an end to this Jesus movement, it was unsettling the peace. And of course number 3, the disciples may be candidates, but they weren't exactly in a position to do it if you look at their mental state at the end of the crucifixion. None of them were expecting it to happen, if you look at what happened when Jesus actually did rise from the dead. And, more to the point, as we've said already, if the disciples had stolen the body, then as they started proclaiming Jesus risen from the dead, they would have known that actually Jesus was indeed rotting in one of their attics. And as they started facing persecution and death for these beliefs, would they have held on to that lie in the face of all of that? The truth would have come out. Or what about this? People say, well, the disciples were hallucinating. They imagined they had seen Jesus, but they hadn't actually seen Jesus. Now, hallucinations can occur. I was talking to a psychiatrist friend recently, and he says, yes, it is true that sometimes people can hallucinate and imagine that they are seeing people that are actually dead. But he says, actually, the phenomenon of the appearances of Jesus don't fit with what we know of how hallucinations normally take place. Hallucinations normally happen to individuals. These appearances of Jesus didn't just happen to individuals, but to whole groups, all at once. Hallucinations normally happen at the periphery of people's vision. They see a face in a crowd, they hear a voice or something like that. But Jesus appears at the center of their vision. They see him, they touch him, they eat with him. And he says hallucinations normally lead to the breakdown of people's mental well-being, whereas the appearances of Jesus had the opposite effect, emboldening these disciples to take on the Roman authorities and implant a new movement that turns the world upside down. Hallucinations don't do that kind of thing. So there's one more option, isn't there? And that is this: Jesus actually rose from the dead. As ridiculous as that might sound to us in our 21st century Western minds, actually I would want to suggest this: it's the one option that actually fits the evidence. It's the one option that fits the evidence. So why don't we believe it? Well, I guess maybe you're saying, because I can't believe it. Because I'm an intelligent person and I got into Warwick University. I mean, I didn't get to Coventry, I came to Warwick. Sorry. No, sorry. Get away with that here. But I'm an intelligent person, and we say, look, we live in the 21st century. We know that those kind of things don't happen. People back then, they might have believed that kind of stuff, but not me. Okay? Now, first of all, I want to say this. I think people 20 centuries ago that knew that dead people stay dead just as much as we do. And you don't need to have a PhD in science to discover that, okay? But also, I think it was just as challenging and hard for the early followers of Jesus to come to this conclusion as it is for us, just for different reasons. We struggle to believe in the idea of resurrection because we might be 21st century materialists. They struggle to believe in the resurrection because their worldview equally had no concept of it in the way that it appeared. For a first century Jew to believe that the God of the universe would turn up on planet Earth as a human being, live among them, die in agony at the hands of their enemies on a Roman cross, and then come back from the dead 3 days later in the midst of history, was no more part of their worldview than it is for us. And the reason why we know that is the case, amongst other things, is this. 3 times in the book on your table, in the Uncovered book, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection. He says very clearly, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, and then I'll rise from the dead 3 days later. And Jesus goes to Jerusalem, he dies, and 3 days later, what do we find? Do we find the disciples having a little conflab? Guys, it's 3 days. Remember what Jesus said was going to happen? Let's go and see if it's happened. We don't have that. What we have is the women going to anoint what they think is a dead body, and the blokes probably doing what blokes do early in the morning, they're still in bed. Nobody is expecting the resurrection, because even though Jesus said it was going to happen, it hasn't crossed their minds that it really could. You see, they didn't come to this conviction because it was neat and easy and fitted with their worldview and was comfortable. They came to the conviction because they were convinced it was true. And it threw their worlds upside down. And I tell you what, if Jesus rose from the dead, of course it throws our world upside down, whatever your belief system or religious background. But if it's true, it's worth thinking about what that might mean. Well, what might it mean? Nearly finished. If Jesus rose from the dead, what does it mean? Let me suggest 3 things. Firstly, if Jesus rose from the dead, it affects our past. Secondly, our present. And thirdly, our future. It affects our past. As we said all week, the problem that all of us have is that there's stuff in our life that's wrong, that spoils our world, spoils our relationships, and cuts us off from God. And what we've been saying all week is that when Jesus died on the cross, he died to deal with that barrier between us and the God who made us, so that we could be forgiven. He died to make the payment, as it were, to deal with the consequences of our wrong. But how do we know that that payment, that Jesus' death was enough? The answer is the resurrection. It's like the receipt. When you pay with your card, you have that nervous moment to see whether the payment has been accepted. At least I do sometimes. I don't know about you, depending on your credit limits. And the resurrection is that sign that says payment accepted. Jesus' death was sufficient. There is a way to God. There is opportunity for forgiveness and a fresh start. The past can be forgiven. And that's wonderful. Have you ever experienced that? The fresh start that Jesus can bring. No more guilt or shame, because Jesus has dealt with it. Secondly, what does it mean? It means the present can be different, because if Jesus is alive, it means that the Christian faith isn't about following some dead teacher from 2,000 years ago, but it's about having a relationship with a God who is alive and by his Spirit can be with us in every experience of life. And that is tremendous. Christian faith isn't about following a set of rules. It's about a relationship with a God who is real. A relationship with Jesus Christ. And that is a relationship which can change our lives from the inside out, giving us hope and purpose and significance. And lastly, it can change our future. Is there hope for the future? Is the question of tonight. The resurrection says yes. Because Jesus didn't just rise as some kind of disembodied ghost from the dead. He rose physically. And what the Christian faith says, what the Bible says, is this, that because Jesus rose from the dead physically, there is hope. Not just some spiritual, fluffy hope of going to a choir practice and sitting on a cloud and playing a harp and that kind of thing. But a real hope that one day this real physical world can be made new. And that us with our physical bodies can one day be made new. Christian faith talks about a whole renewed creation. And it's all based on Jesus and his resurrection. And that gives us ultimate hope. Hope through life and death and eternity. A few years ago, I was working with a guy in Leicester, where I now live again. And we worked together over the summer. And then when I went away to college in Edinburgh, I heard that his wife had been diagnosed with cancer. We followed the journey over months as she sadly deteriorated and then was eventually told that she just had a few weeks to live. Eventually she died. A couple of weeks later, the funeral was held in a little village chapel just outside Leicester where they lived. And something very strange happened at the funeral that no one there will ever forget. Because as they brought the coffin into the chapel with Barry, Paula's husband, their kids, an extended family and friends all in the chapel, a song was played over the loudspeaker, and it was a well-known song to many people who went to the church regularly. But what made everyone sit up and listen was that the person singing the song was the lady who was now in the coffin. And in fact, just a few weeks before her death, she had asked to have this recorded and played for this very moment. And the last verse of that song contained these words: "No guilt in life, no fear in death, this is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand. Till he returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ, I'll stand." And she could sing those words because she knew that they were true. That because of what Jesus Christ had done, she had hope. Hope that went even beyond death. And I tell you what, if you have hope that goes beyond death, you have hope that means you can also live life to the full now, knowing that the future is secure. And so my question as we finish is, what do you make of that? Some of you have been coming along all week, and actually maybe you're seriously considering this and what it might mean. But you're aware this is a pretty big thing, isn't it? Well, let me finish with some words that the risen Jesus is recorded as saying in the last book of the Bible, in the book of Revelation. And they're these words, the verses depicted in a painting which hangs not far from here in Oxford. But these words of Jesus say this: "Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me." What Jesus is saying is that he's standing at a door, not a physical door, of course, but a metaphorical door, the doorway to our lives. He's on the outside because actually we put him there. But he wants to be on the inside. He wants us to, well, the picture of eating together is a beautiful picture, isn't it? A picture of friendship, community, like we've enjoyed this week. But he's knocking on the door. Why? Because Jesus doesn't force his way into our lives. But he waits to be invited, because that's how relationships work. And I guess my question to you is, if Jesus is knocking at the door, what is it that is keeping that door shut? What's stopping you from opening the door and saying to this Jesus, actually, I want you to come into my life? And I guess there might be a couple of bolts, as it were, that are keeping that door shut, at least for the present. And the first is this. Maybe it's doubt. Maybe you're saying, well, I'm just not sure. Maybe this is how we perceive embracing the Christian faith. We imagine it's a leap of faith. Do you talk about that? I'm just going to leap off into the dark and just hope that, it's true. Just a leap of faith. And people say, I can't do that. I'm a rational person. We want to say it's not a leap of faith. Think about some of the things that we've looked at so far this week. Back on Monday, we thought about the evidence for God, how it points us towards that. The reliability of the Bible we've spoken of this week, it's something we can trust. It records real history. You've got the way that Christianity makes emotional sense of different areas of life, whether it be human rights or the environment or our fears or our hopes. We've got the evidence for Jesus' life. We've got the evidence for the resurrection. And we've got the way that Jesus has made a difference in people's lives, including many people sitting in this marquee. And actually, when you put all of that together, you realise it's not a leap of faith. It's a step of faith, isn't it? It's actually putting your faith in something for which there are good reasons to be convinced in. And so maybe if you've got doubts, okay, you're not 100% sure, but look, in life most times we make decisions on things that are not 100% sure. It's not to say that it's irrational. There's lots of good reasons. Maybe there's another reason to keep it shut, and that is you're just fearful. Fearful of what might happen if you were to embrace Jesus and to invite him to get involved in your life. And I guess that fear might be the fear of how it's going to change your life. And I tell you it will. It has to. And it won't always be easy, by the way. If you want to have a really easy life, do not embrace the Christian faith, because it throws everything up in the air. But it will be worth it. Maybe your fear is what other people would think, and for some of us, particularly if we live, from a Western background, that fear is just of, maybe a little bit of ridicule and mockery. And I just want to say, look, if it's true, don't be a wuss. Believe this stuff. Go for it. Maybe you're here and saying, actually, if I was to embrace Jesus and invite him into my life, and that was to become publicly known, it would be very difficult for me with my family or back home. And I don't want to make light of that. But what I would want to say is that your experience is not unusual. In fact, I want to say in the history of the Christian church of the last 2,000 years, your experience would be more normal. But Jesus also said something, and if you want to look it up later, look in the Uncovered Books in chapter 8. He basically says this. He says, there is a cost of following me. And the cost of not following me would be greater. And while there is a cost to following me, the benefit, the blessing that you receive when you do that will outweigh, ultimately, anything you have to give up. It is worth it. So don't let fear stand in the way. And maybe tonight, some of you have listened to the talks over this week. Maybe you've heard 5, 10, 20, 24, I think, talks we've had over the course of this week. And you're saying, actually, I think it might be true. I'm not 100% convinced, but I think it might be. Well, I just want to say, why don't you do something about it? So I'm going to finish now. We're just going to have a short moment of quiet, just for you to reflect on what you've heard. And then I'm just going to say a short prayer. You don't have to pray it if you don't want to. Don't pray it if you don't mean it. There are plenty of hypocrites in the Christian church. We don't need any more. Okay? But if you'd like to actually respond to what you've heard, then maybe this prayer is something you just want to echo in your heart silently where you sit. We'll have a moment of quiet to reflect, and then I'll pray. Lord God, I'm sorry for the way that I've often kept you out of my life. but thank you that you don't want to keep me out of yours. Thank you that Jesus lived and died and rose again. Thank you that I can know that that is true. Thank you that he did that for me. Please, will you come into my life now? Forgive me of the stuff that's wrong. Give me this hope that can go even beyond death. And help me to enjoy your presence and friendship with me through all that life holds. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Well, as with other nights, we're going to take a short break. And what you can do is you can send your questions in to Slido. If you've still got questions, send them in, and we'll deal with a few of those in a minute. But also, what we'd love you to do would be to take a moment now and to fill out those feedback forms. So could you just literally, actually grab those feedback forms now, pass them around the tables, and then take those pens that are in the middle and pass them around too. Because this is the last night and the last event, we would just love it if everyone could do this. If you've done one before, don't worry. You can, at very least, just leave some anonymous comments. Tell us what you've enjoyed this week, what you maybe haven't enjoyed, what you'd like next year when Wonder comes around again, which speaker you think will be better than the bunch that you've had this year and whatever. Leave us your comments. But also, if you're saying, yes, I want to open the door, I want to get started, or at very least, I'm very seriously considering that, please would you tick that circle that says count me in? Because we'd love to help you know how to get started. If you're not there yet, but you're saying, I want to explore this further, tick the next one that says, I'd like to meet up with someone. And as we've been saying, a lovely member of the Christian Union will give you a call, invite you out for a coffee, and a cake, if you're lucky, and we'll answer questions, discuss further, and would happily meet up in that way. And of course, if you tick one of those boxes, also leaves your name and number. As we said before, we're not passing that on to anyone else. We're not going to sell your details to any other societies. We're not going to ring you up for the next 6 months. We'll just let you know about whatever you've asked for, okay? So if we could all fill that out now, put your questions in, and then in a few minutes we'll be back to wrap up with our last Q&A of the evening. Thank you.
Right, thank you. We're going to have the Q&A in just a few moments. I would like to apologise to anyone who might be from Coventry Uni. I can't say more. The CU doesn't agree with what Michael said about Cov students. He does agree with a lot of things that I do agree with a lot of things that Michael says, so maybe I need to rethink that one. Oh, lights. Amazing. But yeah, just want to say a big thank you to all of those who put in a lot of hard work for this week. There's lots of people behind the scenes who've done a lot of things and slaved away for hours and hours so that these events could run. So I'd just like to say a massive thank you to those people, and we can show our appreciation now to all of them.
You, but I have been so interested in what I've heard this week throughout all the talks. But I mean, next week this tent isn't going to be here. We're going to take it down. There's going to be no space here. You know, where am I going to go if I want to find out more?
I'm so glad you asked me. Just wait a second. There's too many things in my hands. I have got for you flyer, and this flyer, which is on everyone's tables, says, "What next?" And on this flyer, it tells you exactly what's going to be happening next.
Wow. Do you guys have this flyer as well? I think you might have some on your tables. Well, I can see a brunch tomorrow. What is that about? A brunch tomorrow at 10?
I am so glad you mentioned it. It's even going to go on a slide on the screen any moment now. But there is a brunch tomorrow in Fab O.03. And I think Fab O.03 is that big building over there. So join us there tomorrow from 10 till 11 for brunch.
Wow. Well, I can see the next one down. It says about a meal. Now it's a bit later in the day, isn't it? I might be able to get up for that one.
Yeah, and there'll be more substantial food as well, if you're interested. And that will be in OC1.01, which is in the Oculus. And that is on Monday, from 6 to 7, thinking about a new identity.
Wow. Once these events are over though, how can I keep exploring? I still want to find out more.
Yeah, there's even more. Don't you worry. We've got a Hope Explored course running every Wednesday for the next 3 weeks in OC0.05. Whoa. I can bring biscuits. There will be at least biscuits, and we'll be exploring Christianity more in those weeks. If you want to find out more, we would love to see you there.
It also says here that I can join an impact group.
That is true.
What is an impact group?
Impact Group is a small study group where you can look into the Bible more deeply with some people from the CU. If you want to get involved, you can. I think it says on the flyer you can go to a website to do that. Or speak to anyone who looks like they're from the CU here. They've got jumpers on, they're probably smiling at you too much. And they will get you involved for sure.
Wow. So many opportunities. Please do check the flyer out in all seriousness and see what we've got going on.
And if that wasn't enough, we have a resource table at the back. There's free books. Go and have a look. They've all got to go. We'd love you to take 1, 2, as many as you like. And also, if you enjoyed the talk, if you want to hear more of the talks, they are all online. They're on the Warwick Christian Union YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find them all there to catch up if you missed any. Also, exciting, there's more food. So at the very end after the Q&A, if you want some more cake, go and grab some.
Amazing. Let's get to some questions now.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
I apologise.
Here we go. We've got lots of questions in. So, Michael, you said that the disciples weren't expecting crucifixion. Surely by now, they believe in miracles enough after they've seen Jesus do so many to at least check out the tomb after 3 days.
Yeah, good question. So the disciples clearly had their world pretty shattered already by Jesus' life, and certainly by some of the things that Jesus could do. So why weren't they, expecting the resurrection if they could see these things? I think because even then, even in spite of what they had seen Jesus do, calming the storm with a word, or making a blind person see with a touch, or feeding 20,000 people with a boys' packed lunch. Even after that, even after bringing people back from the dead, what we might call resuscitation, because they weren't not going to die, they're still going to die again at some point, but bringing them back from the dead, even after all of that, the idea of resurrection, the idea of going through death into a new dimension of life, never to die again, the idea of resurrection was still something that just didn't cross their minds as being feasible or possible in the here and now. And so, yes, they had seen a whole lot, but this was a whole lot more than even they were expecting at that point. And someone who's looked into that quite a bit, Chris mentioned him at lunchtime, this guy called Tom Wright. He's a New Testament scholar up in Durham for many years, now based in Oxford. He's written a whopping big book called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And there's probably very few people in the world that have studied it more than him. And actually that's one of the things he looks at. So it's actually, if you look at Roman culture, if you look at Jewish culture, if you look at the first century culture in which Jesus came, nobody was expecting this. This broke their preconceptions. So why did they suddenly embrace it? And his conclusion is the same, ultimately, that actually they embraced it because it actually happened.
Thank you. Next one we're going to go for is, doesn't the resurrection break the laws of science? Isn't that impossible de facto?
Yeah, interesting question. I remember I was leading a tour around Israel a number of years ago, and we had about 50 guests, and we were going around looking at the kind of different literal, physical sites, where certain events happened. Obviously, there were some places where we're fairly sure, and some places where, the exact location may not be so sure. But we've been going around Israel on this tour, looking at biblical kind of places. And most people there were probably committed followers of Jesus. Some people were there exploring it. I was chatting to one lady at the end, and she said, how have you found the week? And I said, it's been great. Hasn't it been wonderful just looking at these places where these events took place? and thinking about the fact this is real history and not just kind of make-believe and stories. And she looks at me and she was a bit like, sorry? I was like, why don't I like coming to these real places? She's like, well, you actually thought it happened? And I think she felt it was a bit like a Harry Potter tour that we'd been on for the last 10 days. It was like, you know, here's Diagon Alley and here's, you know, as if it didn't really happen. But I said, no, absolutely. And she says, well, you actually think Jesus rose from the dead? And I was like, well, yeah, I do actually. And she says, but I'm a medical doctor, I couldn't believe that. And I thought, all due respect to medical doctors, I mean, you don't have to be a medical doctor to know that dead people normally stay dead. We don't believe this because, you know, dead people normally rise from the dead. And in fact, if they did, of course, we wouldn't be talking about this event, would we? If this happened all the time. We're talking about a very unique event, once in all of history, in fact. Now, unique events can happen. We believe in things sometimes not because they happen repeatedly, like the Big Bang, but because the evidence seems to point towards that as the best explanation of the evidence that we see. So, statistical likelihood is one thing. But also what I'd say is this. The laws of nature tell us what normally happen in the world. And by definition, a miracle like resurrection is not something that normally happens. So because Jesus, the creator of the laws of nature, was able to depart from what normally happens in this instance, doesn't mean that I therefore say everything else goes out the window too. No, I just say maybe someone has interfered so that what normally happens hasn't happened in this instance. C.S. Lewis puts it this way. He says it's a bit like, you know, imagine if you've got £5, £10, two £5 notes in your drawer back in your room, and you get home later and you only find £5 in your drawer. You don't say, oh, the laws of arithmetic have been broken. You say, well, the law of England has been broken. Someone's nicked my money. Someone's got involved. So the laws of nature tell us what normally happened, given no outside interference. What the Christian faith claims is that the creator of those very laws has stepped into human history, and so that what normally happened at that time didn't happen, and therefore we should check it out. But that doesn't mean we throw science out. Not at all. And if you are questioning about that, go back to the talks on Monday, which we looked at on that.
I'm just going to go for this one because you asked if anyone else could come up with another explanation. So a real explanation could be that grave robbers came along, robbed the body, and the disciples and family in grief acted out and made stuff up.
Yeah, interesting question. Really, when you think about the 5 pieces of evidence that we looked at, you could boil it down to 2 central claims. Number 1, the tomb is empty. And number 2, the disciples were convinced that they had encountered Jesus. One without the other wouldn't have been enough. You know, the empty tomb alone didn't do it all. In fact, if you read Mark's Gospel, the women at the end of Mark's Gospel, they encounter an empty tomb and they go off terrified because they haven't quite got it yet. But if you read the other accounts of Jesus' life, you see what happens next when they then encounter the risen Jesus. So even if we could posit that grave robbers, against all odds and for no discernible motive, did manage to get past the Roman guards and steal the body, even if we were to posit that as a possible solution for the empty tomb, we've still got to explain what were the encounters. How do we explain those things? We haven't explained that away yet. Because these disciples were absolutely convinced that Jesus was alive. And they said that they had encountered him. Not just an empty tomb, but they'd encountered Jesus. So how do we make sense of that? And, as we said already, they were willing to suffer for it. Now, when I was a kid, I used to make up stories quite a lot. I used to make up stories to get myself out of trouble. And I could say things like, you know, my sister did it, or the dog ate it, or it was on fire when I arrived, and that kind of stuff. And I always made up stories to get myself out of trouble, but I'd never make up a story to get myself into trouble. So you don't do that kind of thing, do you? Why would the disciples make up this story of encountering the risen Jesus, given how much trouble it got them into? Yes, they were in grief, but it wasn't exactly like, you know, believing in the risen Jesus, if it was just a corpse or a stolen body, was going to change things. That just compounded the problems in some ways, didn't it, physically? So we've got to ask, what about the empty tomb, but also what about the appearances of Jesus? We've got to make sense of both.
Okay, I think we'll go to this one next. Do you think it's possible that Christianity is a response to fear of hell?
Yeah, interesting question. So is it that we fear the idea of hell And therefore, we come up with the idea of the Christian faith. And I guess you could say that's a kind of variation on the Freudian argument that we looked at earlier, a projection of our human longings. So the kind of converse thing of longing that there is a heaven is the kind of longing that there isn't a hell, and therefore we invent the idea of Christianity to do that. And I guess we can always posit kind of psychological explanations for why people may or may not believe things. But as I said, when the argument cuts both ways, we realise that it's not actually an argument that tells you whether something is or isn't true. So if the Christian faith isn't true, yes, you could say maybe people believe it to make themselves feel better. But the reason why we believe the Christian faith is true is because it's based on an event, Jesus' life, death and resurrection. And you need to go back and check that one out. Though some people come to embrace the Christian faith because they fear hell? Well, I want to say two things. Firstly, the Bible does talk about the reality that there is a consequence to our rejecting of God. Hell is an English word that we use to translate a word in the Bible called Gehenna, which was a physical place just outside Jerusalem, which was a picture, a metaphor that Jesus used of ultimate separation. If you were in Gehenna, you weren't in Jerusalem, the city of God, where God's people were. You were on the outside. And Jesus said, ultimately, if we are to reject God and his love and his forgiveness, then we will be on the outside, not because God forces us there, but because we've chosen, as it were, to be there. So the Bible does talk about the reality of the consequence of rejecting him, and it also says that wonderfully in Jesus, there is the opportunity of not having to face the separation we deserve through what Jesus experienced, as he took the separation we deserve, the hell we deserve, so that we don't have to. So yes, in a sense, Christianity does give us wonderful news that there is no judgment to fear. But also, what I want to say is the reason for embracing the Christian faith is not just, I don't face the judgment I deserve. It is also, wonderfully, I now enjoy the life that I don't deserve. It's not just fire insurance that you take out on your house in hope that you're never going to need it. It's a beautiful invitation to life as it was meant to be lived in relationship with God. So it's not just the avoidance of something bad, it's the embracing of something wonderful. And it's wonderful because it's based on something true.
So this question is, I think, looking at what will happen at the end of the world. Apparently, in physics, the leading theory is that the universe will suffer a heat death. What does Christianity believe will happen in the distant future?
Yeah, thanks Lord Thickest III. I was very excited yesterday. I discovered Lord Thickest III, and I realised who'd been asking all the questions this week. His identity was busted. But anyway, what's going to happen in the ultimate future? Well, I guess extrapolating from what we see from a purely naturalistic point of view, that would be the most likely scenario that people would say. That's where we're headed. But of course, if we are to say that there is more than just the naturalistic world, if there is a God who set this world in motion and sustains it, which is what the Bible says, then actually what would naturally happen, given no outside interference, isn't necessarily what will happen. And the wonderfully encouraging message of the Christian faith is that we're not facing, ultimately global extinction, but this idea of a new heavens and a new earth, which is what the Bible talks about. So not so much that we float off to some other dimension, but that God restores this physical world, just as Jesus' physical body was restored after his death through the resurrection. And that actually Jesus brings about this new life for the universe, for the cosmos, which is wonderful. It's also tremendously unique, because no other worldview or belief system holds out that kind of hope, not just of life beyond death in some other dimension, but this life renewed and transformed that the Bible talks about based on the resurrection.
Okay. Why isn't there better evidence for the resurrection? Why not come today when there's videos and photographic evidence and stuff?
Yeah, so why not better evidence? Why not videos and stuff? I mean, number one, I think I would just say, do you believe all the videos you see online? Like, seriously? Like, that would convince you? Like, I saw this TikTok video and now I'm going to become a Christian. Like, seriously. But also, like, more seriously, yeah, of course, could we ask for more evidence? And yes, the answer is always, yes, we could. Could God give us more? Yeah. But I guess I want to ask the question, and that is not, Could God give me more evidence? To which the answer is always going to be yes. But has God given me sufficient evidence to make faith in Jesus a reasonable choice to make? And I think what we want to say this week is, I think the answer to that one is yes. So yes, you can always demand more, but what are you going to make of the stuff you've got? Doesn't mean you're going to be 100% sure, but like we said, 100% proof is very rarely available in most dimensions of life, not just the kind of faith realm. But it does mean that we've got enough to be going on to say this is reasonable. And just a little word of warning, sometimes it can be easy to say, well, if I have more evidence, I believe. One of the interesting things is, in a sense, the people living in Jesus' day who encountered him, met him, touched him, and so on, they had more than we do. They literally did meet Jesus. And yet what's interesting is even then, many of them were saying, oh, give us more evidence, Jesus. He just fed 20,000 people with a boys' packed lunch, and it's like, no, give us more. Which kind of makes me think, like, no matter how much we have, it's very easy to say, no, give us more. And maybe that isn't so much because we need more, but maybe it's because actually we like making excuses for why we don't want to believe. And so my question maybe is it that I just can't do it, or is it that I don't want to, and I want to kind of rationalise my choice there by giving it a kind of different reason? And I think sometimes you have to kind of honestly evaluate that as well.
Yeah, this question's similar actually. Do you think conviction is a choice? If you can't be convinced by something, isn't believing in the resurrection asking for the impossible?
Is conviction, I guess in the sense of like convicted that something is true, is that a choice which is asking people to believe the impossible? Well, obviously, you can't just believe something that you don't think is true. We're not just saying it's like, just believe it. It's not like Alice in Wonderland. Just try hard enough. You can believe in possible things before breakfast if you want. But that doesn't mean that in life we can go from being unconvinced to convinced. We might do that all the time in different ways. We change our mind as we look into the evidence, as we evaluate stuff. So just because at this moment in time you're saying, I can't ever imagine ever being convinced, that doesn't mean that you couldn't be. And if you're saying, I can't imagine ever being convinced and therefore I could never be, that's a dangerous place to be in, because if we adopted that kind of way of attitude, or that attitude in other areas of life, particularly science, that'd be quite weird, wouldn't it? To say, well, just because I'm not convinced now, I'm never going to... No, don't write it off before you've looked at the evidence. So what I say is actually check it out. Maybe you've come tonight and you say, well, all I've heard is you, like 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever. Why not check out the books? Why not come to Hope Explore? Why not meet up with a member of the CU, ask your questions? If they don't give you good answers, tell them to go away until they come back with a better answer. Don't let them fob you off if you feel that they are. Really check it out for yourself. But also, let me say this. Make sure that your standard of evidence that you require for the Christian faith is at least equal to the evidence that you require for something else. We all have belief systems. And it's easy to say, well, I'm just going to sit here in neutrality until I adopt the Christian faith. But actually, if we're going to reject the Christian faith, if we're going to adopt, say, a naturalistic worldview, what are my reasons for thinking that? How do I make sense of that? Do I have better reasons? Evaluate them and work it out for yourself.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. There's a few more from Lord Thickus III. I think I'll say if your lordship could speak to Michael afterwards, so we could get a few more questions in. But no, we do really appreciate questions, but sorry that we can't answer everyone's questions. But do stay around afterwards to ask more questions. Okay, I'm going to go for, I have an issue with the concept of the Holy Trinity and Jesus as the Son of God. I believe he's God's messenger, who is human and only human. Thoughts?
So the Bible talks about this idea of God being three persons: God the Father, God the Son, Jesus, God the Holy Spirit, God's unseen self that Jesus sends and can be with us in life. And Christians have used the word to describe that idea as the Trinity through history. It's not a word we find in the Bible, but it's a word that describes what the Bible says about God. And some people get all sorts of kind of problems with that. How can God be 3 and 1? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't fit with what I know in maths. That doesn't fit with what I know of logic. That doesn't seem to make sense. I guess one of the ways that I would find helpful in thinking about this is not to kind of say, well, look, here's a 3-leaf clover and there's leaves and there's 1 leaf, or here's an ice cube and if we melt it, it becomes all the kind of things that people have historically done. But I guess maybe one of the metaphors that the Bible uses is the idea of a relationship. At the beginning of the Bible, it talks about marriage, and it talks about a man and a woman being united in marriage, and they become one flesh. 2 people united, and they become one. So love unites the 2 to make them one. One of the fundamental things that the Bible says about God is not that God is power, or God is holy, although he is those things, but that God is love. Now, if you've got a God who's just a singularity and nothing more, then how could God have been love before he created the world, us, or anything else? Because God would be on his own. It's very hard for God to be love when there's no one for God to love. What the Christian faith says is that God at his very centre is a God of love, because he's a relational God. And God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit, 3 titles for 3 persons in the Godhead, have always eternally been united in love. If that blows your mind, good. It's meant to. Beyond our total comprehension, good. If God is real, he's going to be kind of beyond our total comprehension. But it's also a beautiful thing, because if God is love and God created us in his image, it means that the most fundamental thing about being human is that we're created to love and to be loved. And then the incredible thing the Bible says is that this God of infinite and eternal love invites us in to enjoy that relationship of love with him, and does that through Jesus. And that's phenomenal. So the Trinity, some people look at it and say, that's a complicated conundrum. I look at it and say, it is a wonderful, wonderful thing that tells me that God is love, and that he invites me to enjoy that relationship of love with him. But if you've got more questions about that, again, do chat more at the end. Can I just say one more thing before we finish? Thank you so much for your questions. It's been really great. I hope this week, even if you've not been convinced by the answers to the questions that we've given, that you've at least begun to see that Christianity does open itself up to scrutiny and questioning. And potentially maybe you're beginning to see that it stands up to some scrutiny and questioning. And so keep doing that. Keep asking your questions if you're not convinced. But of course, it may be that some of us have come to a position of saying, actually, I think this may well be true. And maybe tonight you've opened the door, as it were, of your life and said, I want to get started with Jesus. Well, if you've done that, a couple of things I'd love to suggest. Number one is, as I've been saying all week, I've got this little booklet called Yes. And it's for those who are saying yes to the offer of Jesus' life and hope that we've been thinking about. And if you'd like one, I'll be around at the end. Grab one off me before you go. It explains more about how you get started and what's involved, and it'll take you a few minutes to read before you go to bed tonight, but do that, it'll be really helpful. The other thing I'd want to suggest is make sure you've ticked the box on the feedback form that says count me in, because we'd love to get in touch with you. And if you've got to know someone in the Christian Union this week and you've been chatting to them, then let them know. But another thing I want to suggest is it would be great not just to come to the stuff next week, but why not check out a church on Sunday. If you've never been to one before, there are some great churches around Coventry and Leamington, and they would love to say hello and welcome you. There's probably some people in them that would love to cook you lunch as well if you go on Sunday morning. So why not go? If you're not sure where to go, find a member of the Christian Union who's invited you this week, who's sitting on your table, and go with them. They would love to take you with them. And that would be a great way to get started as well. Head along on Sunday and discover more. But thank you so much for inviting myself and Mark and Chris and Steve and all the guests that have been helping out, including the alumni who've just been basically glad to pretend to be students for another week in the marquee. We've loved being with you, and we do hope this week has been helpful wherever you're at. And if you do want to find out more, do come and see us. Thank you.